So I want to start off by talking about some of the design fundamental principles that go into your concept of making a creative piece of work, such as your CD cover. And to get started, we'll just talk a little bit about format. Format basically will determine your overall size and shape of your project, of your design work. So say, for example, your CD cover, you may have CDs in your collection that vary from the standard jewel case model, which I've outlined for you and I've given you a template for your project. You may have gotten, for example, CDs in the mail, maybe from internet companies like AOL, that fold out from booklets into booklets of some sort. Or maybe you've seen CDs in a DVD packaging, or maybe you've seen CDs in some type of cardboard fold out. There's all sorts of number of ways that you can package a CD case. And what makes appropriate packaging or what makes appropriate design for that piece is largely dependent upon your creative decisions and your practical decisions. What are your practical confines of your project? What do you have to adhere to get the project to work? So in terms of size and shape, your creative choices, you want to think about what kind of format, what kind of aspect ratio will benefit my particular design. Will it benefit from a long horizontal format or a tall, very vertical oriented format? Will it benefit from a creative use of shape? So in other words, something like this, like a long panorama, outstretched brochure or CD cover, or something tall like this might be better suited for a wine glass or, a wine bottle packaging of some sort. Or maybe you just want to emphasize the vertical nature, such as a tall building. In terms of creative choices, maybe you are designing something that would benefit from a circular motif or a custom shape, like this hat here. So these are the kind of creative choices you want to be thinking about in terms of your format. There's no right or wrong answer for format. It doesn't have to go and your pieces don't have to conform to a particular rectangular format. In terms of what's practical, this is where you have to consider the elements such as, for example, on a CD, will it fit on the standard shelves for a CD store? In other words, is it going to be something that creates a problem for the people marketing the product? Does it need to fit in some type of tube? Is it a poster? Is it something that's going to be used for creative packaging? Does it involve some sort of specialized packaging that would require a particular weight of cardboard, for example, to be incorporated into the design? Or is there something that would be in danger of ripping if the paper were too thin? So you have to consider all these factors in deciding upon a format, which will basically determine the weight of the paper that you use, ultimately the shape and the overall design space that you have to work with when it comes to putting in photographs, text, line, the elements of your design. Let's move on and talk about the elements. What are our elements? Well, basically line, type, shape, and texture. And I won't go through each one now because I'm going to cover all of these in detail as we go through this. But we'll talk about line a little bit later. Basically, as far as elements and structure go, what we're dealing with is the elements. If we're going to use like we could use a baking analogy, for example. The elements would be the ingredients of baking that cake. It would be the sugar, the flour, the raw ingredients that go into that recipe. The structure would be things like, how do we mix the ingredients and what proportions, and how long do we put them in the oven for, to bake. So under elements, we've got line, type, shape, and texture. Again, we'll be talking about line very shortly. And then in terms of structure, we'll have balance, contrast, unity, and value and color. So we'll get to all of these at some point in time, but let's go ahead and start with line. Now we talked about format already, but just a couple other elements here that we didn't mention. Say for example, your project is a special project for a billboard or for T-shirts. Then you may have to modify your design even further. You may have to take into consideration size issues that you may not have thought of before, that such as, can an audience read that poster from a distance? Is it something that they would have to be up close to read, or can they read it from a distance? Things like this, if you're designing for something a little bit unordinary. How will size and shape affect your piece? Do you want to use something a little bit larger than your elements would necessitate? For example, a piece that has a great deal of negative space, or would benefit from a great deal of negative space, could have a much larger format than would be normal. Say for example you're doing a brochure, and the standard brochure size for the amount of information you have to publish might be 8.5 by 11, whereas you decide to go with an 11 by 17 format simply to take advantage of the negative space and go for a more spacious feel, more empty feel to your design. So you want to take into consideration your concept for the design in thinking of your overall format. How much information do you have to put on the page? How much information do you need to fit on the page, and are you going to have to cram that information at some point? Do you have paragraphs and paragraphs of text that are really going to clutter your format if you go with a smaller size? Think about these before you get into your elements. We talked about some of these practical concerns, but you can sort of read through this at your own leisure. I'm just going to move on. Let's go ahead and talk about elements, and we'll start off by talking about line. Line is a mood. Basically, when you think about line, you might just sort of pop in your head horizontal lines or vertical lines, but if you really stop and think about how lines behave on the page, it's not just a line in the way that you're thinking in terms of a black line like the ones you're looking at here. A line can be implied. A line can be a line of text, for example, that is used as text can be used as a line very easily. It can be vertical, it can be horizontal, it can be diagonal, it can even be wavy. Given the computer tools you have at your disposal, there's really no limit to how you utilize text, and many designers are taking advantage of that to utilize text as a line feature. Also, illustrations. If you're using hand-drawn illustrations, chances are you're dealing with all types of lines, and the way that you use lines as texture can detract or benefit your design. So in terms of horizontal lines, they tend to convey a sense of peace and solitude. They tend to convey a sense of rest. Diagonal lines, however, tend to convey a sense of energy, a sense of drama, a sense of spontaneity. Also, the placement on the page plays a role. We'll talk a little bit more about balance in the future, but when we have a symmetrically balanced line here in the middle of the page, that tends to further the sense of stability or peace or relaxation, as opposed to something that's crowding the edge of the page a little bit more, like this diagonal line. A little bit lopsided, you'll notice, in terms of its balance. Vertical lines tend to get our attention, but they also tend to be very useful in terms of organizing elements on the page. And in this case, they're showing an example of columns, which can be a very powerful design technique to organize information, especially if you have a lot of it. Wavy lines tend to give a sense of grace, a sense of soft beauty, a sense of tranquility, very relaxing and soothing to the eye, but just also sort of very, very graceful on the page. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of horizontal lines here. Here's an example from a product catalog in which the designer has taken advantage of horizontal lines in several places. The product catalog text, the date up here, the year, and the horizontal nature of the lines of the photograph. Notice how much negative space, of course, there is around the edges as well, which also gives a very symmetrical balance to this photograph in terms of its placement on the page. But this overall horizontal structure of the lines here really convey a sense of peace and tranquility. And unfortunately, you're probably not able to see it, but there's a small, what this photograph is a lot of trees, and it's an outdoors catalog here that deals with a fisherman in a very tranquil, relaxing, forestal setting. And the sort of warm tone of the sepia nature of the photograph complements the warm beige texture. And it also, again, gives us a sense of warmth, of relaxation, of peace. Diagonal lines, however, tend to invoke energy. And that's complemented by their choice of color as well here, these bright oranges and reds for the tickets. But just this sense of depth and dimension with the shadows and with the tickets both give a sense of energy and vitality. Also with this logo up here, the SJI, again, that sense of energy and visual interest just sort of jumps out at you. Vertical lines tend to command attention and also give a sense of organization. As you can see here, the emphasis on vertical lines gives a sense of almost 3 columns here, and dividing this photograph, emphasizing the vertical nature even further by dividing the photograph into 3 columns and then offsetting those columns from the background texture by using value contrasts. Curved lines, here's a good example of curved lines. You notice the curvaceous nature of this illustration really gives a sense of femininity to this Earth Day poster, and this idea of this motherly figure kissing the earth in a very soft, tranquil moment is very well put together through these curved lines here. And you notice the way that they're structured, this diagonal pattern that is only broken up when we get to the face of the woman. And this is really the woman's face, eye, and hand are the only place where they deviate from that structure in the center of the image. So we have this repetition of the pattern all the way through, with the exception of this one deviation here in the middle, which really draws our attention more to that deviation, where our eye is drawn to the place on the page that is different from the rest of the design. So this consistency in the pattern here of these curved lines tends to emphasize the deviation of the designer here in the middle. But just notice the curvaceous nature of the chin, the neck, the nose, the lips. Everything is very curvaceous throughout the whole illustration, even the hands. And it just gives you this soft sense of peace and tranquility, but also a sense of beauty, I think, and femininity. Lines can be used as organization tools as well, especially to join or divide certain elements. You notice here the designer has gotten away with a lot of different types of shapes, rectangles, semicircles, a little slice of pie here, so to speak, different types of text, different types of fonts, different colors even. And it all seems to fit together in spite of the differences of all these different shapes and text elements. Even though you got vertical and horizontal text, you've got bold and you've got italicized text, and you've got sans serif fonts and serif fonts, and you've got different sized, out of place numbers here. It all seems very abstract, but the lines tend to make it work. They tend to bring everything together, almost like shoelaces tying up your shoe. It just kind of ties things together, brings it and bonds it, makes all these stray elements sort of stitched together. Another example, this one's a little bit hard to read, I realize, on the movie, but just notice the nature of lines here to divide these columns in terms of these text blocks, and just the nature of the vertical nature of the columns here, as they tend to, the lines here tends to organize the space a little bit by bringing in this smaller photograph and tying it with the text block. Again, over here, the same thing. Also, the color coordination tends to tie it together nicely with the photograph on the opposite page. Lines can be used to frame objects, and here's a good example with a standard National Geographic cover, which also lends identity to the magazine. This standard yellow frame, which has become the corporate icon of National Geographic, and as it's been used for over 100 years now, it's really it's something that people really recognize from a distance, and so line again plays a significant role in building that identity. In terms of using line as texture, this largely comes into play when you're dealing with illustrations, and here's a good example of using contrast and the texture of the line together as a group to draw your eye towards the center of the spiraling illustrated snakes here, as we can see that there's a snake using the negative space, the white-headed snake that ties together with the black-headed snake. And it's just a poster about an endangered species, an Indian python, but again, the simplicity of the black on white really draws our attention in, and it kind of almost just hypnotizes us towards the center of this image. I was so busy talking about the contrast, I forgot to mention just the rough texture here. Notice the sense of nature that is found here in this texture, these sort of rough, hand-scribbled lines, almost kind of like a carved, an etching in a rock, like an old primitive cave dwelling. It's very primitive, but at the same time, it invokes a sense of nature and a sense of rawness that I think is appropriate. Lines for shading and contrast. Here is a good example of using different types of lines to differentiate different regions. Notice the wavy lines here on the pants and contrasting against the more erratic and less organized nature of the mountain behind the man holding the sign here, and then the contrast of the very straight, angular, vertical, diagonal lines here making up the sky. Contrasted again by the horizontal lines here of the text. So a lot of different types of lines here all on one page, and building contrast is important here because we don't have color information to do that for us. Everything is the same color and the same value on the page, so they're using lines to differentiate the different segments of the poster. Again, we have the contrast example there of the python. So anyway, there's some examples of using line in your design, and some of the things that line can do for you, and some of the power invested in using different types of lines. So anyway, think about that in your own design work, and think of ways that you can utilize line to benefit you and to communicate more effectively.